Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Greg J. Coffee Conversations with Greg J is on. Fooling around a little bit in the studio here. So, you look forward to that opening. Kind of disappeared on me. Today, serious business. We got a special presentation for you. They're in Sacramento, the capital of California. The legislature approved the Reparations Task Force. They were assigned the task of studying and investigating and developing proposals for reparations for American descendants of slaves in the state. They've issued a 400-page report. This is the first phase, I suppose, of the activity, which will ultimately end up, I guess, with reparations, we hope, with reparations to people in the state of California. This was a fantastic press conference that we attended earlier this week, moderated by Regina Wilson of the California Black Media Network. The virtual happening had more than 80 media outlets, mostly and mainly Black media outlets from throughout the state. It included conversations with Assembly Member Reggie Jones-Sawyer, Mr. Tamaki, who's an attorney and his history is that he was instrumental in the legal argument to get the Japanese reparations. Dr. Shirley Weber, the Secretary of State, was there. It was a fantastic discussion and really learned a lot about the work of the task force, the depth of the task force, and exactly what is happening, right in this area. And this could be a blueprint towards the national dialogue. Other states can take notes. The federal government can take notes. This is none of this, excuse me, has never been done before at this depth, at this level. And I think it's very interesting to point out that while we're hearing states trying to suppress and even erase African-American history, you'll see that the state of California is doing the opposite. They're actually running towards African-American history, acknowledging the past, making sure that people are educated and illuminated in these days and time with regard to African-American history. But, enough of me talking. Let's turn it on over to Regina Wilson as she moderates a fantastic press conference that is examining and reporting back to the people the results of the Reparations Task Force findings.
Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's California Black Media and Ethnic Media Service Zoom on briefing. Today's topic will be talking with leaders around the California Task Force on Reparations, the push for equity for African Americans, a topic which coincides with the last day of Black History Month. I'm Regina Brown Wilson, the Executive Director of California Black Media, and I'll be today's moderator. On behalf of EMS and CBM, we would like to thank Dr. Shauna Charles of the Charles Communications Group for her help in organizing today's briefing. The task force is the first statewide task force in the country to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. It will issue its final recommendations on July 1st of 2023. The task, or 2024, I must say. I'm thinking.
No, 2023.
2023. Okay, great. The task force would be historic, setting the groundwork for reparations model other states can follow and that the federal government could adapt for the nation. Speakers today will address, among other issues, why the task force was formed in California, a state that's claimed to be free state, who would be eligible to receive reparations, and how the program could affect the state's economy. Our first speaker today is someone I know very well, our Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, the first Black Secretary of State in California and professor of African American Studies at San Diego State University over 20 years, where she served. Secretary Weber authored AB 3121, which established this task force in 2021. Our second speaker will be Assembly Member Reggie Jones-Sawyer, and then followed by Attorney Don Tamaki. So Dr. Weber, I want to go ahead and start with you. I want to thank you all for your participation, but I would also ask as a brief note that we speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean, who we have today. And we ask that reporters enter questions into the chat. We'll take questions for each panelist as time allows, with questions at the end. So after they talk, you'll be able to ask questions. I will also send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for Charles Communications, who's managing the PR and media relations for the task force later today. So we will begin with Secretary Weber, who will discuss why reparations are critical for the quest for racial equity for African Americans.
Well, thank you, Regina. I really appreciate being with you all today. I'm at this point more interested in hearing and learning from the task force and others of things that have been done. But just let me give you a brief discussion, very brief discussion on AB 3121 and why I felt it was important to author the bill and to put it on California's agenda. Most of you know that the national group the Congress has been grappling with the issue of reparations for, I think, 40 years now, in terms of proposing recommendations as to what needs to happen, what kinds of things need to try to bring some sense of equity with regards to African Americans in the United States, and the discussions of the harm that's been done. And in each case, it doesn't seem to get off the floor. It doesn't get any wind behind it. And once again, the Black Caucus had sent its statement to the federal government saying, we support the reparations at the national level, and we hope you guys will adopt this bill. And of course, everybody's glad to get our letter and our resolution, and in the end, nothing happens. I felt that given the number of efforts that have been made to do this, that California could be an example of what can possibly happen when the conversation occurs. That we were a state that was extremely diverse, and we had done many things as a state and others to deal with the issues of equity. And the one population that has obviously suffered the most has been the African American population as a result of Prop 209. And the various kinds of things without any recognition whatsoever of the harm that possibly has been done to African Americans, and how we need to aggressively and affirmatively address the issue to try to bring some sense of justice and equality to African Americans. So AB 3121 was born in that kind of atmosphere. And as a result, it was proposed and passed by some folks in one session. Was kind of surprised that it did take place, but I thought it was important that the conversation take place in California. It was interesting.
Secretary of State Weber, could you slow down?
I will definitely do that. I am sorry. I was trying to save time, but I won't save anymore. Let me say that 3121 came out of the fact that we could not pass a bill out of Washington. And most folks thought that it was only the South and that needed to have issues of reparations, those states that had slavery. But we know that slavery spread across the United States in terms of its influence and its impact upon African American lives. California, being a state that was supposedly a free state, had many elements in it that hindered the progress and the development of African Americans in this country. And despite the fact that it was not supposedly designated as a slave state, it encouraged slavery, it profited from slavery. And there had been some attempts in the past to basically address those issues, whether it's through insurance policies or a host of other things. We've seen bills that have come before California. We've seen the research that's been done out of the University of California as a result of those bills. But we've never had the development of a task force and an effort to begin to talk about solutions. So as a result of that, 3121 came into existence, not to prove that there was harm done, but to examine the amount of harm that had been done and to find remedy for it. Because no one denies the fact that slavery was very harmful, not only slavery, but post-slavery activities that took place, whether it was economic, whether it was redlining, whether it was a vicious attacks on people's lives, whether it was a stealing of people's property, poor schools, poor resources put into communities that had a tendency to make any progress made somehow or another minimized. So as a result, 3121 is the first state in the nation to basically talk about reparations as a state. It is also one of the wealthiest states, and it is the wealthiest state in the United States and one of the wealthiest states in the world. And so as it begins to talk about reparations and trying to bring some equality, it has the resources to begin to do that. And so with that in mind, all of these issues came forward in California. And as a result, 3121 does exist. The committee has been working for a little over a year to talk about the issues, and hopefully we'll be providing some recommendations that will be coming forward in June or July. It is not the end of the discussion with the task force. It is really the beginning, hopefully, of the legislature taking the recommendations and moving forward with those recommendations to bring some sense of fairness and justice to African Americans who were descendants of slaves, but who now reside in California.
Great. Thank you for that. And I see a question that I will move us along to put in the chat by Henrietta Burrows. How can we best address efforts like those in Florida to water down the accurate teaching of African American history?
Well, what we've done in California, which is as everyone, not everyone, but as certain groups in Texas and Florida and other places are running away from the history, the complete history of the nation. California is running to it. We have passed bills in California that make ethnic studies required at our Cal State University, which is 500,000 students. Every student who graduates from the Cal State University has to have taken one ethnic studies course. We've also made it possible in K-12. And so while others have run from our history, we are running to our history. We're embracing the history of our engagement with our Native Americans and creating opportunities for them as a result of the harm that was done to them. So we have in California said, you know, we embrace our history and we're requiring people to know it and to live by it. And so that is a very different situation. Now, keep in mind, as I tell people, history always has a tendency to repeat itself. The issue to rewrite history is not a unique thing. You know, in 1915, with the whole Birth of a Nation movie, that whole effort at that time was designed to rewrite the history of Reconstruction, to make it, to justify the lynchings and the burnings that occurred, and to try to erase all of the efforts by African Americans who were elected officials in the 1800s, to try to make them seem that they were buffoons and irresponsible when they had authored some of the most important legislation in the United States. So it is not uncommon for people to rewrite history. We have to be smart enough to once again recognize the fact that this whole era of burning books, minimizing people's roles in history, not paying attention to it, and trying to rewrite it so it is favorable to others is not history. And it's something that we should never, ever allow to happen in this nation, that you're going to take whole pieces of history out as a result of it. So we are fighting it. The ethnic studies departments across the nation and the National Association of Black Studies and others are fighting this in Florida. Hopefully we will fight it at the AP level so that maybe AP will not even allow Florida to do AP exams at all, nor to offer courses, because they want to basically take important history out and try to do history themselves when they don't have the experience or the qualifications to do so.
And then there's another question here, and before we go on to Assembly Member Jones-Sawyer, what do you hope to see the state legislature do after 40 years of trying to get reparations off the ground?
What I would hope they would do is to really put together a statewide organization whose task it would be to implement the recommendations. And that would not necessarily be community people only, but hopefully those who have the experience and expertise in the development of programs, the implementation of issues such as housing, dealing with the issues of education, making sure that our kids have access to quality education, and as well as access to the universities, as we did with Native Americans. We've made it possible for anyone Native American to enter the University of California with free education. And so there are a number of things that will happen as a result of the recommendations, that there's an implementation that needs to occur. And it should not be willy-nilly, just one thing and move on. It really has to be much greater than that, because we don't have anyone thus far that we can identify in the United States who spent over 400 years in a suppressive environment where we have had things taken from us, laws have been written against us, people have been lynched and burned, and a host of things. We don't have anyone with as long a legacy of that level of disenfranchisement and harm. And it's going to take more than a year or 2 years to basically construct the kind of society and deal with the systemic problems we have to be able to produce the kinds of results that we need to produce in order to have parity.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to switch over to our second speaker, Assembly Member Reggie Jones-Sawyer of the 57th Assembly District. He's a task force member, and we welcome you to also enter your questions for him in the chat. If you have questions, just continue to put those questions in the chat and I will read them out. But I'm turning the floor over to you, Assembly Member.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you're to assemble this esteemed group to really try to get a grasp and understanding of what we're doing at the task force. Many of us have been working on this for well over 2 years. Some of us even voted on Dr. Weber's bill when it was in the Assembly, and I'm proud to say that I voted for it to make sure it got out of the Assembly floor and onto the governor's desk. But I want to first just mention the names of the task force members, because these are 9 people who have really committed a lot of time, hours, sweat, and equity into making this happen. So we have Senator Steve Bradford, Dr. Amos C. Brown, Dr. Cheryl Grills, Lisa Holder, Esquire, myself, Dr. Jovan Scott Lewis, our chair, Camila Moore, the Honorable Monica Montgomery Stepp, Councilwoman in San Diego, and Don Tamaki, who worked on the Japanese reparations. All of us were appointed either by the Speaker, by the Pro Tem of the Senate, or by the Governor's office. And we bring a wealth of experience to this issue. In fact, if you look at the first report that we did, 400-page report that I don't have my doctorate, but I would ask Dr. Weber, out of all the dissertation papers she's read, I'm pretty sure this one is pretty comparable to a lot of dissertations that she's helped put forth, because it's not only comprehensive, but it's backed up by quantitative fact. And the bibliography alone is quite immense. It's 400 pages, but it really sets the tone for why we need reparations, why reparations are a legitimate concern for California and the country. And I firmly believe the report that we put out last June, others will pick up that document and use it as they start to discuss how we do reparations in other cities, counties, states, and ultimately we should have a national reparations, not only task force, but ultimately have laws that talk about reparations. That has set the tone. For the last year now, we're now working through what exactly is reparations, because it covers a myriad of different things, from the initial enslavement of African Americans, when we were treated as less than citizens, almost as property, and enslaved and brought from Africa, the racial terror that went on in this country from the Klan and others to suppress us from being able to realize our full potential, the political disenfranchisement, where we were not allowed to vote. And it took up until the 60s that we were able access to the ballot equal to our white counterparts, housing segregation, The fact that we were not allowed to live in the neighborhoods like anyone else. And it was a systematic, deliberate effort to make sure we stayed in segregated neighborhoods, which had fewer amenities in them. Separate and unequal education, which is probably the one that's most dear to my heart. The fact that not only people were trying to make sure that we were uneducated as when we were enslaved, but they wanted to continue that practice so that African Americans could not move up and enjoy the benefits of this rich country, especially the fourth largest economy, which is called California. Racism from the environment and infrastructure, the pathology of the Black family, control over our creative and cultural, intellectual life, our stolen labor and hindered opportunity, an unjust legal system, which had resulted in more African Americans proportionally being enslaved in our prison population, the mental and physical harm and neglect, the wealth gap between African Americans and our white counterparts. We now are coming to the point where we've condensed what we believe will help to reverse all of that. As I've always said, as people keep talking about reparations in the form of financial remuneration and compensation, I believe the most important, long-lasting things that generationally will help to reverse what has been going on in this country. As Dr. Weber said, this will not be a silver bullet. We're not to just do one thing. We're going to have to do several things to be able to bring African Americans up to the same standard as others. And so I think in our next meeting in Sacramento this week, we will be talking about finalizing the report that will ultimately go to the legislature on June 30th, 2023, which is very close. Then it goes to the legislature. And that's where Senator Stephen Bradford and myself will probably try to craft the ultimate legislative ideas and the budgetary demands that we will make to the legislature that will ultimately come in the form of some substantive ideas on what we need to do, from things as little or as easy as trying to make sure we have grants or ensuring that we have access to higher education and we're not hobbled with debt, that we have access to capital so that we can buy our own property and be able to close the wealth gap. Because when you look at the wealth gap, as we looked at, it's about owning property. A big part of why that gap is so big, because we were not allowed access to capital and then ultimately owning land. The fact that so many African Americans are in prison in our prison system, we will make recommendations on how to reverse that and ultimately get our people out of the prison system, or most important, in the school to prison pipeline, which has plagued our community in an adverse way. And so there, as I named all the things there, that's just a fraction of what we need to do. In addition, there will be a discussion about whatever financial remuneration it will be and how we can make that happen in a substantive way. Because at the end of the day, again, I want to say, from my perspective, and I think from a lot of the members of the task force, this is not a one and done silver bullet. This is a way that we can not only slowly start to reverse the vestiges of enslavement and racism, but we cancel it and end it and make sure it doesn't creep back into our society again. And so I'm here for questions. And again, I'm glad that we're actually having a discussion with everyone, because I also believe at the end of the day, whatever we do as African Americans and people who join with us, it can be a boilerplate, not only for future people who want to do their own reparations for African Americans in other states and counties and other, but it could also serve to help other ethnic groups who have been disadvantaged because they did not fit the white race paradigm and were kept down, whether you're women, API, Latino. It could be a boilerplate for you to seek your own reparations, what makes sense, and to be able to do that. That's why this is so, so important, not only for African Americans, but for everybody on this call, that we make this happen. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to have some questions for you, but I know that Dr. Weber, I got a note that you have to leave here shortly. And so there's a question that came up for you, Dr. Weber, before you leave. And the question is, the push for can you explain kind of how the push for reparation relates to stop the hate movement? Or do you see there being any correlation?
Well, I would hope that the information that has been presented, and the committee has, as Mr. Jones-Sawyer indicated, has done a tremendous job in providing the information and background information for folks to understand that this is not about hating anybody. It's about trying to make California better. It's about hopefully getting to some of the critical issues that we faced for so many years of education and poverty and other kinds of things in our community, that those who are truly concerned about California and concerned about this nation will embrace the concept that something needs to happen and be a part of the solution rather than simply complaining. Will it stop the hate movement? I'm not sure. And I say this because hate is so powerful and so insidious. And unless we can, I think one of the things that I've found helpful is that information, if people will accept it, to really study the history and culture of others is usually a very good way in which we can combat some of the misinformation and the distortions that come out. We've sacrificed an awful lot of people in the civil rights movement from every ethnic group, but mostly from African Americans. And we still see the vestiges of hate, people promoting it and working against it. The only thing I've found that works at least pretty good is really correct information to those who really want to hear the information. And that's why it's so important that those who have sat through the hearings, or those who are in the process of trying to make a decision, that they go back and listen to some of the hearings and some of the testimonies and some of the things that took place, because that will help them understand why people believe reparations is important, and why it has also been something that this nation has done for other ethnic groups all along, without necessarily causing division and those kinds of things that we sometimes see. Will it solve the hate movement? I don't know. Because we've had such enormous leadership, whether it's Dr. King or Medgar Evers or all kinds of people around the world, and still people find the time and the desire to hate because of own self-interest. So I'm hopeful that the information will at least get to some folks and give them the understanding of what has taken place, and that this is a peaceful effort to try to bring some sense of fairness into the process. It's not about taking over and doing things like they did in January 6th revolt. It is really about trying to find good solutions that will help all of California, because if you elevate any portion of the state, you elevate us all. So I don't know if it'll solve the hate problem. I think information and people somehow or another deciding that they want to do something constructive, it will not only be good for those who are African Americans to take the lead, but it would also be good for others to take the lead, who are honest and who understand what has taken place and how we have done this for other populations over time. That it's not designed to make anyone feel bad about themselves, but it's always to help us correct the errors that we've made in the past. And so, I can't say we're going to eliminate hate, because I'd hope that the civil rights movement would have done that with all the folks who were engaged. But it can, with information and with heart and with a really diverse population of people pushing the concept of reparations, it can, I hope, bring some sense of calm and fairness to the process.
No, thank you. And I know you're going to leave, but this is the last question for you, and then we'll go back to you, Dr. I'm going to say Dr. Jones-Sawyer. I upgraded you. Before you leave, Dr. Weber, what's the most important part of the history of Blacks in California the task force has documented?
Well, I don't know if there's a part that's more important than others, but I surely know that, because California allowed people to vote and those kinds of things, or other places didn't, maybe voting rights was not always the top piece of what took place during the whole process. But surely education is a critical piece, and economic development. Time and time again, we've seen redlining, whether it's in housing and purchase of housing, or redlining in terms of business loans, that our communities are often not given the necessary support to build businesses. And there's countless numbers of stories of people stealing, folks taking people's property. If you've seen the movie The Bankers, you knew that over almost all of downtown Los Angeles were owned by a group of Black bankers. And the efforts made at the federal level to destroy those individuals and to take away that property they'd owned in downtown LA. If they had just been able to maintain that and not have the intervention of the federal government into their business, Black people own downtown Los Angeles. And those kinds of things are really clear of the efforts to, they didn't do us like the Black Wall Street and burn down the city, but they basically took away an awful lot of things that was fundamental to the development of Black people in California. And same is true in the Bay Areas and others. So Central will be obviously making sure that we have strong communities in education and strong economic development, that people actually own land, can do businesses, and their ideas can be supported just like everybody else's ideas in the country are supported. And that's critical. We all know it's hard to get support for Black businesses. And oftentimes the support we get only keeps us crippled and walking a little bit, but never able to run and fly. And so I would hope that would be something we would look at, because that would be long-term investment in the growth of a community.
Thank you so much. Now, Assembly Member Jones-Sawyer, I have a couple of questions here for you that have been mounting up, so I wanted to get those to you. How did the task force go about doing the research?
So we brought in experts from everywhere, not only academics. We brought in financial experts, to economists, to give us an idea of how to quantify some of the harms that have been done to us. And we were open not only to people who were scholarly works and economists, but we also opened it up freely to anyone that wanted to have input into the task force. As an elected official, I will tell you, some of my best ideas did not come from people who were supposed, quote unquote, experts in the field. A lot of it had come from regular folk who've been studying it or looking at something and said, I have an idea, or this is what's wrong. You need to look at this. Even which Dr. Weber had mentioned, for example, I didn't know how pervasive the stealing of land from African Americans was, how pervasive it was. The areas that were stolen were some of the wealthiest areas in California. I didn't know that, and how systematic and insidious it was, because people came to us from the Bay Area or from Manhattan Beach and other places and said, did you know this happened to us? And then we went and got our researchers to go and research and look, and found a wealth of information on just that piece alone, which opened up our eyes to things that we never even thought about. And so I would say we looked from professional standpoint, academic standpoint, and then just making sure we verified our facts. The fact checking that went in this from the Department of Justice was impeccable. You should be very proud of the people that are involved in us, because we have done some miraculous things when it comes to research. And the people that worked on this, for them, this was not only a labor of love, but they felt like this was something that long after we wrap up the books and we put these things on the shelf, that is something that they would be proud of and they could point to their kids and ancestors, say, I did that.
So another question for you is, if the goal, and this is, I think, relates to something you said earlier, Henrietta Burroughs followed up, but the goal is to bring African Americans up to standard of others. How will we know when that goal is reached?
Actually, that's a good question. And I'm like Dr. Weber. We won't know that until we do it. I can see Dr. Weber's pessimism because, as she said, the civil rights movement we thought we were moving toward that. And quite frankly, if you think about it, we got to a point where we had an African-American president. We have an African-American vice president. So politically, you would think we've achieved the pinnacle of everything we want to, and that should have been the standard bearer. If Dr. King had lived to be able to see that, not only would you see how proud he would be about what his efforts led to, but we're also looking at the number of people that are incarcerated, the number of African Americans that do not own homes, that in some ways, it feels like we've gone 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back, depending on your perspective. And so we've got to work harder to get to a point where, and I know that I appreciate kind of the colorblind example of when will we reach that point where there is no hate. I feel optimistic in that even though I have taught my kids to be open and honest and accepting of everyone, they've gone better than me. They're more open and honest, and I consider myself a very progressive person. But my children, the generation coming after us, as long as we do our job and don't teach that hate, as long as we do our job and tell them that you need to embrace multiculturalism and bringing everybody in and treating everyone the same, I'm very optimistic that when we look back at these efforts, they will only accelerate our ability to get rid of hate and have a society that we're ultimately will be proud of where we're trying to get to. And that's when I'll know. Unfortunately, I think I may not be around for that, but I genuinely believe my grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be around for that.
So I know that we have, and I want everybody to know that we have more questions and we have one more speaker, but I'm going to take these 2 more questions for you, Assembly Member, and then we'll move on to Attorney Tamaki. But this is from Pilar Morero. Did I say that right? I'm so sorry, Pilar, if I botched your last name, please forgive me. Where will the opposition to this come, if you expect any, and can this open the door to reparations to other groups?
Let me start with the last question first. I believe that this will open up the door for everyone and will hopefully provide a safe, think about this, a safe place for you to bring up your grievances and your concerns, so that you can move forward, so that we can cure those ills that have been foisted on you by the dominant culture to keep you down. And so I believe that this effort will make that happen. The opposition. The reason why that report is so important is because if you read it, if you really read it and learn from it and take it in and not push back, but really just kind of absorb it and take it in, unless you're just an uncaring person, you will understand why this is so important to do and why we need to make this happen. Those who are closed-minded to this or fearful, as one group said about Jews will not replace us, this is not about people replacing you. This is not about people pushing you to the back or having us overcome and then making you second-class citizens. This is to make us all first-class citizens so that we all will be equal and share in the prosperity which is California. And so that's where our opposition will come, from people who are really afraid that they're going to lose something, that this effort will take away from them. All boats rise. As one boat rise, we all rise. I'll give you just one little example that's been coming out from the opposition that's already started. And they say about inflation. Will this increase inflation? Well, we didn't say that when the dot company, the tech companies boomed and they were making billions and billions of dollars. Nobody said they're flooding cash and money into the economy. We need to slow them down. No, we said everyone will rise and be able to enjoy the American dream if we all embrace this industry, which we did. And so I do not look at any of this as as anybody losing anything. I believe that once we bring everybody up, we also will then start to solve the problems of homelessness, which is disproportionately more African Americans, which and other ills that we're dealing with now, even crime. We'll be able to get rid of crime, because and I hate to quote Republicans, but what some Republicans say was the best thing for crime is a job. That's the best way to stop it, is for people to be able to overcome their poverty and be able to move forward. And that's what African Americans need, and that's what any group of people who have been kept pushed back. And so I'm hoping that they understand this is not anything taken from them.
And then last question for you briefly, because it's a short one, from Manny Otico in the Valley News. What kind of figure are you looking at?
We haven't come to that conclusion yet. I'm a firm believer that I, as a task force member, should not say a number, because if I say it should be $100,000 per African American, and the data shows it should be $1 million or $5 million, then I've capped us at a number. Conversely, if the real number is not anywhere close to $5 million that San Francisco has said, and it's closer to the $100,000, and we can quantify it, legitimize it, and verify it, then I want to make sure we have a legitimate number that we can prove with data that is unreproachable, because that is going to be the first. That's going to be the first thing that people who are opposed to this are going to fight us on.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I hope you'll stick around, because I think that there's other questions in the chat. I have more, but we want to go to our third speaker, Attorney Don Tamaki, also a member of the task force. Mr. Tamaki, go ahead.
Thank you, Regina. I just want to acknowledge Secretary Weber in her enormous contribution, and she hit the nail on the head with the explanation that Congress has not moved on this, despite having it before them for almost 40 years. And of course, discussions about reparations are as old as 1865 and earlier. So it is time to consider and study this and do something about it as a matter of fundamental justice. I also wanted to thank Reggie Jones-Sawyer for his enormous, incredible leadership of years in the legislature fighting for civil rights, and also his leadership on the task force, which has really made the task force stronger. And ultimately, the deliverables that will be produced in June, Reggie Jones-Sawyer's fingerprints are all over it. So honored to serve on this with him. And I also want to thank the California Black media and the journalists on this call, the 80 or so, and to sort of tag along with Reggie Jones-Sawyer's statement about change. 10, 20 years ago, something like this would not have happened. And certainly the numbers of journalists of color and diversity. And that's a tribute basically to, exactly what we're talking about. I do want to say a couple things. My connection to the reparations movement, arises from our own community. I was on the legal team to reopen Korematsu versus the United States, which was a World War II decision, which upheld the incarceration of an entire racial population into concentration camps, which was reopened to establish that there was no reason to do this. And ultimately, it led to, or at least contributed to, the concept of reparations, which is one of the very few examples in modern history where the government has acknowledged a great wrong and put some meaningful financial atonement behind it. That said, there is no equivalence between 4 years in a concentration camp and 400 years of exclusionary policies and enslavement and everything else. But there are some lessons to be learned. And I think the cornerstone of our movement that helped make it successful was the publication of a study and the report. And I just want to reiterate, if the journalists haven't seen this, the near 500-page study that Reggie Jones-Sawyer was referring to, called the interim report, connecting the dots between 246 years of enslavement, another 90 years of Jim Crow, and really decades more of exclusion. And the unique aspects of it is connecting the dots between that past and our current day reality. And noting that, you know, the compounding and the cumulative and cascading consequences of this horrific history we're seeing in our cities and parts of California today. And while the latest scholarship that the report, you know, compiles and synthesizes can be found, it is all in one place in the report. And then there's this connecting the dots part. So for example, in housing, for those of you who would be interested in this, the redlining maps are depicted of the 30s and 40s of Los Angeles or the Bay Area. And if you align, I'll call it the pre-gentrification maps of the most underserved, impoverished neighborhoods, they align exactly, meaning that the fact that we have hyper-segregated, underserved, impoverished neighborhoods in the most polluted areas is not a surprise when you think of it. It's shocking, but the outcomes were actually planned. And that's the insidious process that for many years has simply been viewed as normal, that this focus on reparations begins to unpack. And I think there was a question about how does this connect up to not only Black people, but everybody else? And I would say, yes, the enslavement ended in 1865, but about 5 minutes after Robert E. Lee surrendered, the South was determined to reinstate the ways as close to slavery as possible. Jim Crow followed, and it was imported into California and so-called free states. And it's led to, you know, the redlining and the exclusion and the segregation and everything else that really was only begun to be addressed in the 60s. And now we're just kind of scratching the surface, but everybody, you know, is living with those consequences. And that enslavement really gave birth to what I would say call as a racial hierarchy of a norm that values white lives above all others, and Black and Native people on the bottom and everybody else in between. And while that hate, which morphed after slavery ended, not only put a target on the backs of African Americans, it also put a target on the backs of other people of color or whatever other disfavored groups du jour came along. And of course, during World War II, the target was Japanese Americans, but the one constant has been Black people, who are at the bottom of every metric that matters in California, whether it's housing or healthcare or houselessness and so on. So I do agree with Assemblyman Jones-Sawyer. If we can solve for Black people, it shines a light on everything else, and it's long overdue. And so I can tell you, you know, that other people of color, Asian Americans and other groups, are very interested in this movement and in supporting it for that reason. Great.
Well, then now, are you ready for questions now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So this is from Jorge. What kind of policies are you looking for to prevent harm in the future? And that could be you or Assembly Member Jones-Sawyer.
I'll say a couple words and then turn it over to Reggie to respond to. So one of the principles of reparations is not only things like compensation and rehabilitation, restitution, but guarantees of non-repetition. That is to say, stopping the harm. And the array of proposals, and we're looking at, well over 100 pages of proposals in arising from each of the 13 chapters that the report addresses: healthcare, education, administration of criminal justice. Each of those areas, we're looking at those proposals. There is an array of them. And while certainly compensation is an element of it, compensation to the harmed class of people, the other, much of it has to deal with changes in policy designed to address the harm that we see today and then stopping it. So I'm going to stop here and then turn it over to Assemblyman Jones-Sawyer.
I equate this to when there's a environmental catastrophe, whether it's an industry that's polluting a river, that river then pollutes into a community, which causes cancer and birth defects and all sorts of problems. The same way with air pollution and anything else that invades into a community. And this kind of racism has been prevalent for centuries. We've got to cut off the river of pollution that's going into the Black community. And it's not just a company going in and maybe paying off the people who were harmed, because if they're still producing that same poison into the community, then the problem will persist and not stop. And so I'm a firm advocate of how do we cut off the river pollution that's coming into the Black community. Number one, for me, as someone who was born in the Civil Rights Movement, my uncle was one of the Little Rock Nine, one of the 9 kids that integrated at Central High School in 1957. I know what those 9 kids went through. They were like 15 and 16 years old, and they were spit on, they were kicked. They went through some of the worst atrocities that I don't think we as adults would have put up with. And they went through that through a year, and they had the 101st Airborne would have to come and escort them to school every day. Because of their sacrifices, I was able to go on to USC and to Harvard, and now I'm in a doctoral program at USC with no problems. It's because of their sacrifices to end discrimination in high school. Think about that. Those kids were trying to get into Little Rock Central High School, the best school, the newest school, the best track field, the best chemistry labs. That's what they went there to do. They weren't going there to change history. If you were to talk to any of the 8 that are still alive, my uncle Jefferson Thomas has passed away, they will tell you, we want to change our lives. We want to get an education. So education has always been extremely important to me. And for me, education should be the bedrock of how we reverse the majority of the problems that are happening in our society. Because if we have an educated, and I'm not just talking about going to college, but if you have a skill, I swear to God, if I had to do it all over with, I'd be a carpenter, electrician, or plumber before I went and tried to get a PhD. Because at the end of the day, having a skill to be able to go out and work every day, to make your own money, don't have to work for anyone, to be your own boss, that's what's going to move African Americans forward in the future. We still need people to go become doctors and lawyers and everything, but I honestly believe if we build the infrastructure, the educational infrastructure, starting from pre-K and on, so that every Black kid, education and the things that we provide in our public schools, that they have an equal access to the best tools, best teachers, and opportunities, that everything will rise and we will catch up much quicker, faster than anything else we do and everything else we're going to propose.
Goodness, thank you so much. We're like running low on time, and Attorney Tamaki, we have more questions for you. So the reparations includes policy changes as well as financial payment. Can you talk about that? The policy changes that the task force will, sorry, let me read this. So what policy changes will the task force recommend be made?
I can give you examples. The task force is deliberating this now. Our next hearing is March 3rd and 4th in Sacramento, and we'll be meeting on it, every month thereafter until the report is produced on July or June 30th. But for example, healthcare. So Black people die younger, life expectancy is lower. Black women suffer from 3 to 5 times the complications in pregnancy, childbirth. Black infant mortality is higher than the rest of the population. And there's a reason for that, which the report goes into. And part of it is not having enough, is access to medical care, but also not having enough Black doctors that culturally understand the population and so on. So among the proposals of ways to increase enrollment of Black medical providers. Education, for instance, it's no secret that the most underserved, deprived neighborhoods are the ones that are formerly redlined. And again, the past creates the present. So what's the solution for that? What should we do? And the proposals are talking about increasing funding directly into those communities. In each of the areas, there are going to be proposals with respect to policy to stop the continuing harm. And those will be produced. But to get sort of a preview of the areas, people can scan the interim report. It is online. And while it's near 500 pages, that's a lot. There is a 29-page executive summary. It is written by, professors and PhDs, along with, I'm told, there were 75 people, lawyers included, lawyers and PhDs included, that contributed to that report. But you don't have to have a PhD to understand it. It's really clear, easy to understand, and a great resource, I think, for journalists. So that would cover those areas that we're focusing on for policy.
So we have probably time for you guys to give me 30-second soundbite here. Just, from the takeaways that, what's the most important impact that you want the task force to have on the public's understanding in California?
Reggie?
That California was complicit in the racism, even though we didn't formally have plantations and things of that nature, and that people today who are that non-whites have benefited on the backs of African Americans, and that you should understand that what you have came about because of the suffering of African Americans, and that you really need to think about how do you make everyone whole.
Great. Mr. Tamaki?
I would just add that California was complicit in the institution of enslavement and actively participated in the exclusion that followed. It, in some ways, became a leader in redlining in other areas. But I think one takeaway, it is the leader now in shining a light on a problem that Congress hasn't even had the will to study, let alone do anything about. And that is a huge contribution, not only to California, but the rest of the country. I believe something very historic is going on. And I think it'll have reverberating impact across the nation. So as journalists, I think that's a story to watch. And it will come to a head when we release the recommendations in June. But it won't stop there. I think that's only the beginning.
Well, great. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers today. I want to make sure that everyone knows that we will be sending a recording and expanded bios after this call. I also want you to know that Sacramento, for the next task force meeting is March 3rd and 4th in person and live stream. The in-person meeting will be at the California Environmental Protection Agency auditorium located at 1001 I Street in Sacramento. And then it'll be live streamed on the DOJ's website. I would say the website, but it would probably, there's a lot of other little things. So I think if you go to the main page, the oag.ca.gov, there's a /, and I believe Shauna may put this into the chat. I believe she's already may put it into the chat. You can actually log on there. But as always, it's been a pleasure hosting and moderating this discussion. And I want to thank all of our speakers. And until next time, we will hope that you have a very safe rest of the week.
Thank
you. Well, that's it. Yeah, there it is. The Reparations Task Force, State of California, giving you the full 411 on their progress. I'm going to put in the chat here, just bear with me here, the copy of where you can get the copy of the report and you can delve into it. It's almost 500 pages as they indicated there, but you can see that they are very intentional about this whole topic of reparations. They're very investigative in terms of finding out where exactly the wrongs were into the state of California during the times of slavery, Jim Crow, and all of those things. I think it was very poignant that our experts on the panel, Assembly Member Reggie Jones-Sawyer and Mr. Tamaki, the attorney, indicated that, hey, one of the key takeaways is that California was complicit in the institution of oppression so prevalent across the country. We may not have had slavery and plantations and thus and so, but we did have other expressions of oppression inflicted upon the people that came to settle in the western state of California, the Golden State. There's a lot of history here. There's a lot of stories here, and this panel has done an exceptional job to identify these touch points that would lead to the awarding of reparations to American descendants of slaves in the state of California. That's all I have today. Don't forget to love one another, love one another, love one another. We just want to bring you all of the information, culturally relevant conversations. Thank you so much to Regina Wilson and the California Black Media Network for sharing the press conference. I was there. I was blown away, by the information. And like I said, we're gonna let me just do this right now. I just want to kind of post the link to the report so that you can get into it. I'll tell you a quick story while I'm doing that. I worked at a bank and I was processing foreclosures, and I saw in the documents for the on the properties that we were getting ready to take action on, these conditions, covenants, and restrictions, the CCRs, right, as part of your deed package and all of that. And in so many communities across Southern California, across the state, had race clauses in them, no other persons except no Negroes, Mexicans or Asians can reside here except in a domestic capacity. That's what I saw. And it was so funny because a lot of those areas that had those conditions we're already, predominantly Black or Latino or Asian. It's just really something how this country has in some ways evolved, but certainly the history is still there. It's still palpable. It's still accessible. So then when we talk about, banning or oppressing or stifling the story of Black people in America, uh, this whole conversation about critical race theory, this whole conversation about wanting to eliminate the story of African American history from, the schools. Look, African American history is American history. It happened. And it's not that folks are trying to make you feel bad or those types of things. It still needs to be told. The story still needs to be expressed to the community, to the people, because it happened. It's part of the history. Yeah. All right. California Reparations Task Force. That was the press conference moderated by Regina Wilson, Executive Director of the California Black Media Network. You can see it on demand on all of our Facebook pages. You can see it on demand at our YouTube page. We will repurpose the audio for podcasting, and that will be up in a day or so, wherever you get your favorite podcast, iHeart, Spreaker, Spotify. Just click in Coffee Conversations with Greg J. Go over to Beach City Radio, beachcityradio.com. Go to the Coffee Conversations with Greg J section, and you can see it there as well. All right, y'all. Always remember, love one another, love one another, love one another. We move forward with love, not hate. We're just examining the cultural relevance. It's not a hate channel. This is a consciousness channel. There's a difference. Make it the best day ever. Peace and blessings.